If you're anxiously attached and you're experiencing no contact with an avoidant, then I know exactly what you're going through. It is an emotional roller coaster that is there to truly test you to the core. For those that may be new to attachment theory and no contact, I'm going to shed some light today on what it means to go no contact with an anxious attacher and what they may be feeling during this time. First and foremost, if you are struggling to start no contact, then feel free to go to my website and download the free 14-day no contact journal. Just go to healingwithcharlie.co/links and choose the 14-day no contact journal option. It'll help you get started with the hardest days of no contact, the first 2 weeks. Before we dive into what anxious attachers feel during no contact, let's clarify what no contact means. Essentially, no contact means no contact. No contact with them over the phone, in person, no texting, no calling, no voice notes, no letters. This also means not lurking their social media, such as their stories, liking their posts, or commenting, anything like that. Essentially, it means no direct or indirect contact with this person because it gives you the space to grieve, emotionally process the breakup, and ultimately detach from that relationship. No contact, generally speaking, can last up to 60 days, but for some people, it can go on indefinitely. It really just all depends on the person and the circumstances behind the breakup itself. So now that that's out of the way, let's discuss what anxious attachers feel during no contact. The first phase that anxious attachers feel during no contact is denial and bargaining. Most anxious attachers lose themselves during breakups and relationships. Essentially, they lose the relationship with themselves. They lose their identity of what it means to be a person in a relationship because the relationship becomes everything about their identity. And when that person exits their life, they feel like they lose everything. So naturally, this hits them like a truck and it's a full wave of emotion where they feel overwhelmed. When this happens, they can naturally be in denial about the breakup. It can actually take them a few weeks to even understand that the breakup is happening in its fullest extent. Because of this, during this time, they may subconsciously bargain with their ex to try and get them to stay with them. They may subconsciously bargain with them to try and get them to come back until, of course, they realize that this person isn't coming back and they have to pick themselves up from the ground. It's very typical for many anxious attachers to feel blindsided by the breakup, but chances are there were many signs leading up to the breakup itself that were indicating that it wasn't going to work out. What ended up likely happening was the avoidant moved on from the relationship before the breakup happened. Now, this isn't to throw shade or shame on anyone, but that's just typically how many avoidants process the breakups. Because they are conflict avoidant, they are likely to work through all of the emotions and mourn the relationship before the breakup itself because they build it up as this big dramatic event. In the first phase, anxious attachers may feel as though the breakup was all their fault. They might feel like they could have done this, or they should have done something else instead, or they could have said this to try and save the relationship. But nothing they say or do will change the outcome, and that's just the way it goes. What they don't realize is they're actually struggling from an abandonment wound. They feel as though this person left them abruptly because they had no indication that anything was wrong. Or if they did, they didn't necessarily know that it was that serious. They still always feel as if it's something that they can work through. But what they fail to realize is the reason they feel that way is because they have very weak, porous boundaries. They don't necessarily have those stop losses to recognize when they should leave someone. And many times, avoidants will actually do things to self-sabotage the relationship in hopes that the anxious attacher will do the breaking up first. Again, they are conflict avoidant, and it honestly is easier for them to be dumped than to actually do the dumping themselves because they actually have to be the one to rip off the band-aid first. So naturally, anxious attachers, it's going to hit them like a bus. They're going to be a mess and they're going to feel a whole range of emotions, and they may even subconsciously try to strategize different ways to get their ex back during this time. Speaking from my own personal experience, when I was going through a breakup, I was deep in my anxious attachment wound. I was feeling abandonment, and these are all natural things that anxious attachers feel during a breakup. What I didn't realize is I was actually trying to use certain methods to get my ex back. I was trying to write them letters. I was relying on certain coping strategies, such as protest behaviors, to try and get this person to realize what they're walking away from. But nothing I could do would change the fact that they didn't want to be with me anymore. And that is completely normal. I feel like a lot of anxious attachers need to go through that at some point in their life to realize that they never want to go through that again. And the only way they can do that is by changing themselves, because essentially a lot of those behaviors are manifesting within, even if they actually think it's from this other person. At the shortest, phase 1 can last anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, but if you've been going on much longer than that and you still feel stuck on your ex, don't think that you need to really get over the relationship quickly. This is not an exact science, but I've seen most anxious attachers will go through the grief and bargaining phase within 2 to 4 weeks. Then eventually they come to terms with the breakup a little bit more, which leads them into phase 2. Phase 2 is considered grief and acceptance. Now, they may have come to terms with the breakup a little bit more, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're over the breakup or the relationship. They may still be stuck on their ex and they may still be a wreck, but essentially, their emotions have started to stabilize a bit more, and they no longer maybe think that the relationship and the breakup was all their fault. Their feelings will fluctuate between still missing their ex and wanting them back, and essentially they've come to terms with the fact that they may not get back together anytime soon. So they still have feelings of sadness and they may still be crying throughout the day, but they're not necessarily doing things from a position of strategy. They're not necessarily trying to get their ex back anymore. And you might find them slip into feelings of despair. They may feel as if all hope is lost, and this can actually be some of their darkest days. Sort of like the darkest night of the soul. It's during this phase where thoughts and memories of their ex can still cross their mind, sometimes uncontrollably, and they may still be fixated on thinking about their ex. And naturally, who wouldn't? You've been in a connection with this person, and they've been your supply of emotional support. That's one of the key signs of an anxious attachment style, is you lean heavily on other people to essentially fill your cup. And now that they're not there to fill your cup, you aren't necessarily doing things to fill up your cup yourself. You're still just stuck in that limbo where your cup is empty and you don't have anyone else there to fill it up for you. And that's one of the defining factors between anxious and secure attachers, is when secure attachers go through a breakup, they will switch to getting their needs met while also still feeling their feelings, whereas anxious attachers will just be stuck in their feelings and not necessarily taking the steps to fill the cup themselves. Depending on the depth of their abandonment wound, they may actually try to move on during this time, or they may even engage in short-term hookups and relationships to actually try and get that abandonment wound filled. Chances are these relationships and short-term flings don't typically last, and they really just serve as a means to help that person move on from the relationship where they next enter into stage 3. However, phase 2 can actually last anywhere between 4 to 8 weeks until they actually transition smoothly into phase 3. Phase 3 is marked by radical acceptance of the breakup and the relationship. They definitely accept that they're not getting back together, and here is where you start to see them relying on certain strategies to get their needs met. They may start to hang out with friends a bit more. They may start going out again. They may start picking up hobbies again that they once left off to the side during the relationship. Again, going back to the anxious attachment style, they tend to lose themselves during the relationship. And so too their hobbies. They tend to neglect those, and sometimes their friends as well. So this whole phase is marked by a reconnection with those things in an attempt to reconnect with themselves. It's also at this time where you find that anxious attachers will take their avoidant ex off of a pedestal. They no longer see them as this big, amazing person that is no longer in their life, and they start to see the forest through the trees. They can start to see a path at which they can move forward, perhaps alone or with the support of friends and family. For some anxious attachers, they may rely on feelings such as anger to get them through this phase, especially if their avoidant ex hasn't tried to contact them since the breakup. So anger can actually be a very healthy emotion. Acting on it, however, isn't. So if you feel anger during this time because you see maybe your avoidant ex is moving on, they're having the time of their life, and they're not really processing the breakup in the same way that you are, that's totally fine. Work through those feelings of anger, so have them serve as motivation to become a better person for yourself. This phase can last anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks, where they enter phase 4, which is where they actually begin to move on. By this point, anxious attachers begin to fully understand the relationship for all that it was and the breakup and how it played out, and they actually just choose to prioritize their own personal happiness at this point. They will actually try to start dating, although it may be too soon for some. Many will actually try to double down on that even harder, especially if they're unaware of how their anxious attachment style is basically controlling their life. When they have this abandonment wound, when the avoidant is no longer there to fill it up, if they try to start dating again, those anxious attachment strategies will come up very quickly, and they may have success in finding someone, but chances are the same anxious avoidance cycle will just play out. This can also be a really bad time to reach out to an anxious ex, because if dating isn't really going well for them, they may actually be angry at their ex. It's not uncommon that when you start dating again, you're gonna have a few duds here and there. Like, you're gonna meet people that just aren't really for you, or perhaps you feel like the cycle of being abandoned is happening all over again. No matter what's playing out, many anxious attachers will start to feel angry toward their ex, because they might feel as though if their ex just hadn't left them or broken up with them, they wouldn't have to be here in the first place. They wouldn't have to try and start dating again. They wouldn't have to try and move on and find someone new. Really, it's just a sign that they may still be attached to their avoidant ex, but they may fail to realize that their avoidant ex isn't necessarily the source of these issues. They're not necessarily causing these relationships to not work out. But all the anxious attacher can feel during that time is anger towards their ex, because they probably would have stayed in that relationship regardless, and they wouldn't be here if it weren't for them walking away from that connection. So generally speaking, if you have an ex who is anxiously attached and they're going through this phase right now, you're probably just better off avoiding them, not reaching out to them, because chances are they may not be very receptive. They may actually snap at you. And I've worked with many avoidants who have reached out to their ex when they noticed they started dating again, and they felt rejected because their anxious ex just exploded on them. Really, they were just working through the challenges of trying to move on and find someone new, and it wasn't working out for them. So naturally, they just took it out on their avoidant ex. So if you're the avoidant ex, don't reach out to your ex at this time. You'll save yourself a lot of pain and heartache and rejection as a result. However, the next phase is actually the best time to reach out to an anxious ex, because it's really marked by nostalgia of the relationship you both shared. Keep in mind though, if it was your anxious ex that initiated the breakup, then it's going to be a lot harder to try and win them back, because it really does take a lot for an anxious ex to walk away from a relationship. Generally speaking, they see themselves as very loyal and fiercely committed, whereas someone else might just see that as somebody that's unwilling to recognize when they should walk away from a relationship that isn't serving their greater good, because they have really porous and weak boundaries. Whatever side of the coin you fall on, just know that it's going to take a lot of work to try and win an anxious ex back, because they don't want to get hurt again. That's really what they have to work through. They don't want to feel hurt by their next partner. And when it comes to their ex, they don't want to make it seem like it's so easy for you to come back into their life. So you really have to prove to them that you're safe and that you're worth the energy to try and make it work. So if dating for them up until this point hasn't really been going well, they may start to feel nostalgic for their ex and the last relationship. They may start to feel like, oh, I had it so good in that last relationship. I wish we could just make it work out. And if you were to reach out at this time, you may actually be received very well. They may be receptive and may be more willing to actually meet up and catch up in person. Although anxious attachers may actually reach out to you first. Their signs may be indirect, but also they may be just very direct. Anxious attachers have a tendency to be overly direct with their exes, but you may find as well that They may try reaching out to your friends first, or your family or coworkers to see how you've been or what you've been up to. And then afterward, once they feel safe reaching out to you, that's when you'll see them try to make a lot of progress and movement toward you. If you typically see that happen, then it's probably a good time to try and reconnect. Just keep in mind though, that just because you're reconnecting doesn't necessarily mean it has to flourish into another relationship. I've seen exes get back together briefly, only to then realize that maybe they weren't the best couple and they just remained friends afterward. It's actually easier to be friends with an ex after some time has passed and you reconnect and realize maybe it's not for the best, because you go about it in a very mature way. Whereas when you try to be friends with an ex immediately after the breakup, you don't have all of that time, healing, and growth to really mature and understand what friends under that type of context would mean. So don't be afraid to go into it with an open mind. If you both reconnect, just take it one day at a time and really see what you've been up to during that time. How have you both changed? How have you both grown? And what are you now doing differently to try and nourish better relationships moving forward? You might find that your communication actually improves during this time and you see each other both through a more mature lens now that you've both gone through this together. But also keep in mind that just because an ex is feeling nostalgic about the relationship you had doesn't necessarily mean it'll work out. This time apart doesn't necessarily mean they've healed or that they've changed at all. And so going back into that connection, it's really important to consider your needs and wants, because you don't want to have history repeating itself. You're basically just repeating the same anxious avoidance cycle and you're not really getting anywhere. It's kind of like a hamster wheel at that point. If you're going through no contact with an anxious ex and you'd like some advice, then feel free to go to my website and book a one-on-one session with me. My website is healingwithcharlie.co. I'd be happy to help coach you through what no contact would look like, especially if you're trying to get your ex back. Also, if you're in the stage where you are reconnecting with an ex and you'd like some advice, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to work with you. So those are the phases an anxious ex will experience during no contact. It is definitely an emotional roller coaster, and there are certain times where it's better to reach out to them versus others. If you find yourself navigating this type of relationship with an anxious ex, then I wish you all the best. I honestly think that this is the best time to start working on yourself to grow into somebody that you couldn't have even imagined. So I wish you happy healing, and I will see you in the next video.